Colonizers are people who are not indigenous to the lands they settle on. They take the land and whatever is on the land and they make it their own. Most settlers of European descent look to take the land for themselves, their family, and the next generation. These white settlers then tried to involuntarily assimilate the indigenous people into their colonies. Native Americans were forced to walk onto reservations where thousands died from cold, illness, and starvation.
Decolonizing is one of the biggest challenges facing the indigenous people in the world today. As descendants of settlers and colonizers, we have to figure out what choices we can make today to become what some term as settler allies. In order for that to happen, we have to explore what the term indigenous means.
According to the article, Indigenous People, Indigenous Voices by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, practicing unique traditions, they retain social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of dominant societies in which they live. Indigenous people are found in all parts of the world.
We have, for many years, not only colonized indigenous land with the intent of erasure of indigenous peoples and bodies, but their culture, their creations, their art, and their history. Resistance decolonizes, which is an important part of coexisting with the original inhabitants of the land we currently live on.
Decolonizing is a shift from a settler state of mind that many non-Indigenous Americans share, to a mindset that offers Indigenous people sovereignty in all aspects of their lives and their creations. Their point of view has for so many years been diminished by colonizers. But by decolonizing the way that we, as non-Indigenous people, think, we offer Indigenous peoples validity on their life. One must acknowledge Indigenous ideas, art, and all other Indigenous creations as valid creations and representations of communities to decolonize.
As Matthew Herman states in his article, 4 more Indigenous projects for the Native American humanities, community-based programs and projects can perform decolonization by supporting Indigenous knowledge, values, and interests, and by utilizing Indigenous collaboration or control in knowledge production, application, and distribution. One may ask, how do we decolonize?
One needs to be informed on Indigenous struggles and worldview before one is able to begin to decolonize. Acknowledging that the land that we all live on is the ancestral homelands of over 562 tribes. It's an important step of decolonizing the way we think. Non-natives are, as Cindy Holmes states in her article, Everyday Decolonization, challenged to mask and unlearn white settler colonial ways of thinking and beginning in the world and to listen and learn from Indigenous people.
Another step to decolonization is recognizing that something has been colonized. It's sometimes hard for non-Indigenous people to realize that the media they are consuming or the thoughts that they are having is in a colonialistic frame.
For example, many Americans have had the thought that this land belongs to all Americans, all citizens. In order to decolonize that view, think of that statement in a Native American frame. Who owns the land according to natives? No one owns the earth, we simply take care of it. As Leanne Simpson states in our article, The Place Where We All Live and Work Together, neither nation owns the land in a Western sense of the word. Instead, the focus is on our joint responsibilities for caretaking of the land and ensuring that the coming generations inherit clean and healthy lands so that life, all life, may perpetuate itself. Thus, you can shift your Western and settler mind thoughts of land ownership to a more decolonialistic thinking of mutual balanced and respectful relations with the land. Thinking about the history of natives and their views in regards to what needs to be decolonized is essential, but who and what needs to be decolonized?
Everyone does, from indigenous peoples to non-indigenous peoples. Digital media is an example of something that needs to be decolonized, and is something currently in the process of decolonization by indigenous filmmakers. Indigenous filmmakers in the past 20 years or so have created comedies, dramas, and documentaries, as well as blockbusting action films. Indigenous film can help us both reckon with our past and create new movies worth watching, as Indigenous filmmaker Alexander Tessar says in his article, How Indigenous Filmmakers Are Changing Contemporary Cinema. Tessar also states that films construct narratives, and those narratives can construct identities, and Indigenous filmmakers are currently working to represent their communities on screen accurately, to construct valid narratives of Indigenous peoples.
Western thought also needs to be decolonized. Since Westerns have settled in native lands many years ago, their worldviews and ideas have been forced onto Indigenous people. The colonistic mindset attempts to undermine the tradition of natives. According to Matthew Herman's articles, 4 or more Indigenous projects, we can decolonize by Indigenous knowledge production, application, and distribution. But why do these items and others need to be decolonized?
To save the planet and our lives. Matthew Herman also says that we need to enable communities and peoples to come together, transcending their own colonized contexts and experiences in order to learn, share, plan, organize, and struggle collectively for self-determination on the global and local stages.
Herman also states that change and mobility are not the enemies of culture, but rather necessary preconditions, since cultures that can't change don't survive. Therefore, if our settler mindset and culture does not change to reflect the rise of activism and realization of our harmful settler ways, our country's culture shall not survive. Culture is always changing to reflect our ever-changing world.
We can aid Indigenous people in decolonizing by giving them platforms to heal on, by lifting voices, providing platforms and funding, and having spaces for their values. We aid decolonization. We must also decolonize to acknowledge our country's history of oppressing Indigenous people and committing genocide of their people. We must also be decolonized because we are on Native land. The University of Minnesota is built on Dakota land. By decolonizing, we acknowledge that the land we inhabit doesn't belong to us and was forcibly taken from Indigenous peoples. We can never make up for what the U.S. did to them, but we can help Indigenous peoples' voices be heard for their modern sovereignty.
Decolonization is important for Indigenous communities. It allows them to thrive and share their experiences, struggles, and plans in a non-Western majority space. We must remember that decolonizing is neither an easy job nor simple, but it is necessary.